You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Dr. Laura Uthwaite, and I'm a Principal Research Fellow at UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, and I'm also a UKRI Policy Fellow. In this season of Research for the Real World, it's all about how research evidence informs policy and how that plays out politically. And today we're looking at what change research shows the early years education system would benefit from, as well as what it's like to provide evidence to government and parliament. So with that, I'm very delighted to have Dr. Claire Crawford in the studio. Claire is an Associate Professor of Economics and a Research Fellow of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. She's also a colleague of mine at the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, and she heads up our early years strand. Her research focuses on childcare and education and is particularly interested in understanding inequalities and how policy can help reduce these gaps. She also has a strong track record of high-impact research, including giving evidence to a number of select committees on education, social mobility, and diversity and inclusion issues. So I'm very excited to welcome Claire to the podcast and discuss her fascinating research today. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Laura. Great to be here.
Great. So normally when we do the Research for the Real World podcast, we like to ask a question to our guests about how they came to get to this point in their academic journey. So how did you become interested in this area of research?
Well, I started my career outside academia kind of around 20 years ago now at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, as you mentioned in my bio. So when I arrived there, I was given a choice of kind of two general areas of research interest, and one of them was education. So I guess that kind of set me off on the path initially. It's something I'd always been interested in, so it was great to be able to continue that in a formal way. I've worked on a number of different topics over the years, focusing on various types of education and labour market issues. But more recently, I've been working a little bit more on early education and childcare. So I guess I started that maybe 10 years ago or so with some work looking at earlier policies that had been introduced in England to provide greater support to parents with the costs of childcare. And we looked at some of the implications of those policies on parents' labour supply in particular. And that set me off kind of thinking about those types of policies. And I've since gone on to look at their benefits for children as well as parents. And I'm also going to be working on an evaluation of some of the new policies that have been rolled out relatively recently.
So it sounds like you've been really busy in this space. Has there been any kind of particular highlights in your journey so far?
Well, I think the highlight for me is that the work I mentioned, which looked at the effect on parents' labour supply. And the reason why that's a highlight is because it was used by the Treasury and the Office for Budget Responsibility in their thinking, which went into the new policy that was announced in the budget last year. So the new policy is going to extend support for children in working families, providing children as young as 9 months with up to 30 hours a week in term time of funded early education. And our research kind of spoke to the potential effects of that policy, what effect it might have on parents' labour supply, how much they're working, whether they're in work, the number of hours, and so on. And so that was really great to see our work being used to inform a new policy that's since gone into effect.
That's really great. So obviously with all of these changes being made to the early years education system, obviously that comes with a financial cost. What is the current state of the financial support for early years education, and what changes have you seen over the time that you've been working in this area?
Well, this is an area which has seen a kind of massive expansion over the last 20 to 25 years or so, growing from a point where there was really very little support for early education or the financial costs of childcare to a position where we now have a significant amount of money spent on it each year. And that's going to increase in the future as this new policy is rolled out. So one of the big changes that we've seen over that period, as well as a kind of general expansion, is the types of families that are receiving that support. So at the beginning of the expansion, there was a policy of universal entitlement for 3 and 4-year-olds to have a small number of hours of funded early education every week in term time. That then increased over time, was expanded to working families. There was a policy as well that was expanded to disadvantaged 2-year-olds. And alongside that, there has been support through the tax system as well. So reimbursing parents for a proportion of the amount that they're spending on childcare as well. So we've got quite a mishmash of policies, if you like, all providing slightly different support. But one of the big changes that we've seen is a move from those universal policies or the support targeted on lower income families and towards a state now where we're seeing much more of the budget expected to be spent on working families in general and particularly richer families in the distribution. So in the next few years, we're going to see the proportion of the budget spent on childcare subsidies going to working families expanding from about 30% where it is now to more like 60% in 2 or 3 years' time. So that's really a big shift in terms of who's benefiting from this support.
So do you think there are any kind of like major implications of these new early education entitlements?
I guess one of the biggest implications is the fact that we are really seeing a refocusing or an expansion of support for families who are not at the poorer end of the income spectrum, but rather are working and already have kind of sources of income. So part of the motivation was of the policy was to support families with the cost of living. It was introduced at a time when inflation was very high. There was a lot of discussion about the high cost of childcare and how much parents were having to pay each week or each month in order to be able to cover the time that they would need to work. And so that was a big part of the story. But that also means that we now have a system which is providing relatively more support, more advantaged families, and relatively less support to less advantaged families. And obviously, if you are interested, as we are at CPO, the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, interested in inequalities and making sure that all children have access to the same opportunities, that's obviously a kind of perhaps a different situation to the one that we might ideally see in order to reduce inequalities.
So you have already mentioned that there's been a kind of patchwork of policies from various different governments. And obviously now that Labour are coming in and they've brought various plans and promises within this area, of what you know of these kind of sort of future policy priorities, how do you foresee these kinds of things playing out in this area, particularly maybe even for the disadvantaged versus the advantaged families that you've already alluded to?
So I guess one of the key things that resulted from the kind of recent election and the focus on what policies people were going to be supporting in the run-up to the election is that Labour came out in support of continuing with the expansion of the entitlements, which was announced by the previous Conservative government, but actually much of which is now going to be happening what now Labour are in power. So Labour had already pre-committed to that policy, so that, I guess, puts them in a little bit of a bind in terms of their room for manoeuvre in terms of repurposing that budget. One of the things they have spelled out in a little bit more detail, though, is how they're going to find the places to deliver these new entitlements. So obviously some of the families who will be eligible for this new subsidy once the policy is fully rolled out will already have been using childcare, but other families may be newly using care as a result of this policy or for other reasons. And so we might need more places to be made available for all of those families to be able to access them. So one of the things that Labour has announced is that they're going to focus on delivering some of these places by repurposing space that is being freed up in some primary schools as a result of a falling number of children of primary school age over the coming years. So their idea is that they'll use some of that space, which may otherwise have kind of gone to waste or been used for different purposes, to encourage schools to use that space to offer preschool early education instead. So their commitment is to try and open 3,000 new nurseries through that route, which they hope will offer around 100,000 new places. And if that was successfully delivered, then that would cover all of the new places that the Department for Education are estimating will be demanded over the next few years in response to this new policy. So that's quite a significant announcement that they've made in terms of the way they'll go to try and deliver these places.
So with that, that's a very kind of like focused so much on the sufficiency of places and making sure that there is enough places for the children that need them. Do you have any thoughts around the implications for the quality of children's childcare and early education? Obviously, we know that there's kind of process quality and structural quality because, we work in this field, but can you give a little bit of insight to our listeners about what these kind of like broader implications may be?
Yes, I think there's certainly been a focus on the quantity of places or the number of places. That's been the kind of primary concern so far, but you're absolutely right. We definitely need to worry a lot about what the quality is going to look like, because most of the kind of international evidence that exists, certainly in terms of the benefits for children of accessing early education, is that it's got to be high quality in order for it to see those really positive benefits that have been found in some studies. So in terms of the two things you mentioned, I guess, so structural quality we think of as measures that could be more easily regulated. So they're kind of features of the setting, like number of children who can be looked after by each staff member, things to do with the kind of maximum number of children that could be in the setting at any one time, the qualification levels of staff and so on. So those are things that we might think of the government having the ability to more easily regulate if we wanted to. But actually what's been found to matter a lot for children's outcomes is what you termed process quality, which is a little bit more about how children and staff are interacting on the ground. So what are the day-to-day relationships like? How much time do children spend with their kind of key worker, the main staff member that might be responsible for them in the setting? What other types of things are going on inside the childcare environment which matter for children's development? So those things are all very difficult to measure. So it's very difficult for us to get a really good handle on what is the quality of a setting. Obviously, we have Ofsted ratings for early years settings as well as schools. So that gives us a kind of good indication of whether settings are meeting a kind of minimum standard of what parents would expect for their children. But being able to go beyond that is really challenging. And I think one of the difficulties with these policies is whether settings will have the funding to be able to support the types of investments that might help to boost their quality. So investing in higher qualifications for their staff or professional development for their staff, perhaps investing in new resources for the children to access and so on. So the good thing about the new policy is that the funding rates for these young children who are being offered kind of funded care under the new policy is that the funding rates are relatively higher than we've seen in previous kind of incarnations of the policy for older children. And they're higher not just because younger children have to have more staff to look after them, but also higher relative to what we might have expected based on the kind of funding rates that have been seen previously. So from that perspective, I think, there does appear to be the resources to support an investment in quality, but we'll obviously have to keep a kind of a keen eye on that over the coming years to make sure that that's the case.
Thank you for summarising, all these kind of quite complex issues in a very, like we say, patchwork of policy landscape. And so based on your research evidence, what recommendations do you have for what kind of improvements could be made to reduce inequalities in the early years and why?
So I think drawing not only on my own research, but also the kind of wider evidence base, I think, coming from a perspective of wanting to be able to support all children to access care, to be able to access high quality care, and to hopefully kind of go towards reducing inequalities that we see, very large inequalities that we see by the time children arrive at school, I'd probably recommend that we kind of repurposed what's now a very large early years budget to move that focus away from the kind of relatively better off working families that we discussed earlier were the kind of main beneficiaries from this new investment. Change and also kind of moving from a situation where, as you said, we've got a patchwork of policies, each of which is targeting slightly different groups with slightly different eligibility criteria and so on. I think if we were able to put all that together and come up with a kind of single progressive subsidy model, so a single model whereby all families were able to access some support, where the subsidy rate, that is the amount that parents are kind of subsidised for every pound that they spend on childcare provision is much higher for families who are poorer and much lower for families who are richer. So it could be that we're providing children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds with entirely free care, so 100% subsidy rate. And that could be gradually reduced as we see families kind of having higher and higher income, up to a point where maybe for the wealthiest families you would see no subsidy, so a kind of 0% subsidy, and they would fully cover the costs of their childcare. So the advantage of that would be that you'd repurpose most of the money towards the families from the poorer end of the income distribution. So target the resources towards the children who evidence suggests are most likely to benefit from having access to high quality early education. And that will also hopefully help to reduce inequalities in access for sure, and hopefully also reduce inequalities in their kind of the outcomes that we see by the time they reach school. And then I think I'd probably try and couple that with some funding which would go directly to settings to try and support them or to incentivize them to provide high quality care of the kind that we were discussing earlier. So the system I've described is very similar to a system that's been introduced in Ireland relatively recently. So they have a progressive subsidy model for parents, and then they have a kind of what they call core funding for settings. And the idea there would be to kind of provide this core funding to settings who met a kind of set of criteria that you designed to kind of target the conditions that you most wanted to see. That could be things like staff qualification levels or the provision of professional development, or it could be things to do with the availability of places for children with special educational needs and disabilities, for example, or, as is the case in Ireland, to ensure that providers are not charging kind of high fees in response to some of these subsidy systems. So you can use that to try and encourage providers to deliver the types of care that you would like to see, basically. So I guess if I had total control over the budget and hadn't made any commitments to existing policies and so on, that might be what I would be recommending the Secretary of State to think about.
No, that's great. And maybe they might listen to this episode, who knows? So you have also dealt firsthand with a range of different select committees, as well as calls for evidence and working with the government. What's that experience been like?
So it's something that's kind of built up over the course of my career, I would say. I mean, as a researcher interested in impact and hopefully doing work that matters for questions that policymakers are considering. And if, in the ideal world, policymakers saw our research and kind of put it into practice so that we saw more evidence-based policy, that's the kind of goal of, certainly the goal of what I'm trying to do when I'm thinking about conducting a particular research project or looking at a particular topic. So over time, I've reached out to policymakers through a number of different routes. I think, one of the great things that we have in our kind of system are the select committee hearings. So this is a way through which the government can be held to account for different aspects of their policy. And the great thing is that the committees put out calls for evidence and invite responses to questions that they're interested in asking the government about. And that provides a kind of ready route for researchers like me to tell them about our evidence. That also happens a little bit sometimes when the government itself puts out consultations on particular policies that it's considering. But the select committees happen kind of fairly regularly on topics that we might have research to tell them about. So I'd really encourage people who are in that position to keep an eye on the things that select committees are putting out and do submit if you have something to say in response to those questions. So certainly that kind of, responsive approach to sharing research has resulted in me being invited to kind of give evidence, oral evidence to the committees on a few occasions. And that's a pretty intimidating experience from my point of view. You're kind of in a committee room with lots of people looking at you and asking questions that you may or may not have any idea about the answer to. But it certainly does provide a kind of direct route through which your research can be heard by people who have control or responsibility over what might be said by the committee. And it's really, really pleasing to see your work being cited in reports. I know your work's been cited recently, Laura, in reports, and ours in the centre more generally has appeared a few times. And it's great to see how people are using your research, that it's really satisfying.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Sometimes, research can be hard in many different ways, but it kind of makes it all kind of worthwhile when you see it being put to good use. So yeah, definitely agree on that. So you have mentioned throughout our conversation many different projects that you've been busy involved in, and that's all really great. But what we'd love to know is what's next? Where are you going to be taking this line of research in the future?
Yeah, so one project we've been working on a little bit recently, which I didn't mention and should have done when you asked me about kind of what to think about in terms of reducing inequalities in future, is a project where we've been looking at the take-up of the existing early education entitlement. So we have already, as we mentioned, a universal entitlement to some funded early education for 3 and 4-year-olds. And we also have a similar policy for 2-year-olds from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So the take-up amongst 3 and 4-year-olds is very high, kind of around between 90 and 95%. But for 2-year-olds, it's a bit lower, around 75% in the most recent data. And that varies across different types of families, but also it varies a lot geographically. So one of the things we were doing in that project was to explore how the take-up varied across different areas and to understand to what extent those differences could be explained by the kind of local context of the areas. So the types of families that lived in the areas or the availability of childcare places there and so on. And then we looked to see what we couldn't explain using those types of factors. And there we were interested particularly in understanding whether there were things that the local authority was doing. So the local authority is the kind of organisation that's responsible for delivering the early education entitlement policies on the ground, so to speak, in their local areas. They're responsible for kind of liaising with parents and providers to ensure that there are enough places and that families know about them and so on. So we were really interested in seeing whether we could discern specific things that they were doing that looked to be really effective in supporting take-up. So some of the things that we were interested in exploring was to what extent they were kind of working with providers to ensure that places were available, to what extent they were supporting families to apply for these places that they need to do to ensure that they're kind of meeting the eligibility criteria. And I think the thing that came through most strongly was that there isn't really a kind of silver bullet. There isn't one thing that you can do that's going to really boost take-up. In the areas that looked like they were outperforming their local populations, if you like, if they seemed to be having higher take-up than we might have expected, given the types of families that lived in their areas and the places available and so on. They had a really kind of comprehensive strategy in place to work on all aspects of the kind of challenge from a variety of different directions. So they had a kind of clear strategy in place. They were working with other professional groups like health visitors and so on to make sure that all opportunities were taken for people to talk about, taking advantage of all opportunities, if you like. They were, really kind of making sure that parents understood what was available to them, that they were eligible, the potential benefits, supporting them with applications and so on. It was a really comprehensive strategy. So I think in order to ensure that all local authorities can deliver that kind of support, there's obviously going to be a need to ensure that they have sufficient funding to do so. So we've obviously seen quite a reduction in local authority spending over the last few years or so, and that's had a knock-on implication for early years teams as well in many areas. So just being able to ensure that they've got the resources to deliver those types of services is probably going to be important in ensuring that the policies are delivered effectively. And I guess one of the things that we'll be looking to try and do is see whether there are ways in which we could look to expand some of that work and think about whether we can evaluate the effectiveness of doing so. So are there ways in which we can work with some local authorities to try and develop these types of strategies and then look at the impact? I think another thing I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be involved in the evaluation of this new rollout of the funded early education entitlements. That'll be fascinating to see whether what our research pointed towards kind of in the past, whether that comes to fruition once the new policies are rolled out. And I think the other thing that we talked about earlier that will be really important over the coming years is the role of quality. What can we do to support quality, make sure that providers are incentivised to create environments that we think are offering the highest quality care for children? And can we kind of identify the effect of that on children's outcomes in the future as well? So I think they're the kind of big questions that we'll be thinking about over the next few years.
Well, it sounds like we're both going to be very busy.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll be getting you to work hard on it, Laura.
Can't wait. Thanks, Claire. It's been really interesting to get to know more about your research, and particularly to understand this kind of patchwork of policies and how there's multiple different strands of thinking that need to kind of go into this very, very complex issue. So listeners, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. You can follow Claire on X, the website formerly known as Twitter, at Claire_L_CRAWF to learn more. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 22 past seasons. Just search IOE Podcast to find more episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And a quick favour before you go, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you are enjoying the show. And this will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Laura, and thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.